Hello ladles and germs, welcome to the answers to portfolio questionnaire number 5. Question 1. True or false? Monopolistic competition is similar to perfect competition except that in the latter, i.e. perfect competition, all firms produce identical products. So let's think about the features which characterize these two types of models of markets. In the case of, we look at the number of competitors, the two models are the same. Both assume that we have many competitors in the marketplace. Each firm produces a very small market share. Second, the knowledge possessed by buyers and sellers is assumed to be the same in both models. That is, buyers and sellers have pretty much perfect knowledge. 3. Barriers to entry and exit. It's the same in both models. There are no barriers to entry or exit from the market for either of these models. However, when it comes to the last feature, the nature of the products, we say that perfectly competitive firms all produce exactly the same product as each other, perfect substitutes, whereas in the case of monopolistic competition, each of the firms produces a slightly different product to their competitors. There is a slight product differentiation between them. They are close substitutes, but not perfect substitutes. So the answer to that is that it's true. Question 2. True or false? An oligopolistic industry is one in which each firm has a very small market share, but there is a tendency for them all to collude with each other to fix prices. Well, we think of what's an oligopolistic industry. The term is a composite term, oligos and poly. Oligos means few and poly means many. So it's referring to a market in which there are only a few sellers in the marketplace and there are many buyers. Now, if you only had a few sellers in the marketplace, say 4, would it be the case that each of those firms would have a very small market share? And by very small, we might say 1% market share. Could they all only have 1% market share? No. If they divided the market in between them equally, they'd all have 25% market share, which is not very small. If, say, 2 of them were very dominant, we might say 2 of them have 40% market share and the other 2 have 10% market share. In that case, 2 of them have an extremely large market share. No matter which way you slice it and dice it, it can't be the case that all of them have a very small market share. So this statement is false. Question 3. True or false? OPEC exhibits cartel-like behavior. What's a cartel? A cartel is an association of producers who agree to fix common prices and or output quotas in an oligopolistic market. So, does OPEC do that? Well, the first port of call is to look at OPEC's website. So it's not like some kind of secret cabal or anything. They're pretty public. They have a website. Here's from their website. OPEC is a permanent intergovernmental organization of 15 oil-exporting developing nations that coordinates and unifies the petroleum policies of its member countries. Now that sounds to me like cartel-like behavior. They are coordinating and unifying their policies. Here, policies means how much each member country is going to produce in an attempt to gain some measure of control over the price of oil. The only real question that arises here, I mean, it seems like pretty open and shut now, but the only real question that could arise is maybe That's what OPEC claims, but is that what OPEC does in fact? Is there a difference between their talk and their walk? Well, it's certainly the case that there are times when members of OPEC, although they might form an agreement to restrict the amount of oil that they supply to the market, or increase the amount of oil they supply to the market, some member countries occasionally will go rogue, so to speak. They won't stick to their quota. They won't stick to the agreement. And that could be for all sorts of reasons. It might be for geopolitical reasons or diplomatic reasons. It might be because of internal political reasons within the country. It might be because a particular country is facing particular economic difficulties, or the government might be facing fiscal problems at any given moment in time, and so it's not in their interest to stick to the agreement. So sometimes the cartel doesn't hold together perfectly, so it doesn't function as a cartel properly. However, there are many cases where the members of OPEC do stick to their agreements, and they do in fact coordinate their behaviour in an effort to control the world price of oil. A secondary debate is how strict we want to be about defining this cartel. So some people might want to say, well, it's only cartel-like behaviour if they can control the price of oil and they can control the world supply of oil. Now, that's a bit too strict because it's 15 oil exporting countries. That's not all the oil exporting countries in the world. So OPEC doesn't have direct control over the total supply of oil to the market at any given moment, and therefore doesn't have complete control over the price of oil. But they can seek to, and do seek to, and sometimes, and do, in fact, influence the price of oil. So I think if we're a bit more relaxed and give it a more realistic definition to cartel-like behaviour, we can say that OPEC definitely does exhibit cartel-like behaviour. It's true. Question 4. True or false? Price discrimination occurs when a firm charges some customers lower prices than others for an identical product. Well, this is true. This is referring to what's called third-degree price discrimination, which implies there's first-degree price discrimination and there's second-degree price discrimination. There are other types of price discriminatory behaviour, which we're not going to look at right now. You can look them up if you like. But here we're talking about third-degree price discrimination. And this refers to a situation where a firm segments consumers into distinct submarkets, because those different groups of consumers have different demand characteristics. They might have slightly different preferences, or they might have different purchasing capacities. They might have different income levels, for example. And then it will charge each of these different submarkets different prices for exactly the same product. So we see that, for example, with cinema tickets. You've got the market gets segmented into senior citizens, adults and children, for example. Or the zoo, same thing. And it's for exactly the same product. So this is definitely true. Question 5, true or false? In the long run, a monopoly could earn zero economic profit. Now, some of you will remember from last week that I asked this question in Portfolio Questionnaire 4, so this is a bit of a boo-boo on my part. Nonetheless, what's the answer? So let's say we've got a monopoly here, it's operating in the long run. Remember, when we've got the long run, we've got an average total cost curve which is downward sloping, indicating that there are economies of scale, and then we've got this upward sloping part to the average total cost curve, indicating diseconomies of scale. You'll also remember from a video that there is some dispute amongst economists about whether the diseconomies of scale is actually a real-world occurring phenomenon for monopolies. But we're not going to worry about that particular debate because it's not really relevant to this question. So, let's say we had a demand curve for the firm's product, for this monopoly's product that was set here. Now, if the firm, for example, for some reason or other, decided it would produce 7 units of output, we can see that the firm would make a loss. The average total cost, the cost per unit at the level of 7 units of output, is higher than the average revenue or the price that the firm would be able to charge for that. So it would make a loss per unit of output. If it produced here 23 units of output, again, the firm would make a loss. The cost per unit is greater than the price per unit, the revenue per unit. If it produced 35 units of output, again, we can see the firm would make a loss. The cost per unit are greater than the revenue per unit or the price. There's only one point at which the firm doesn't make a loss, and that is here, at the price of $6 producing 15 units of output. But we'll note that at that output and price, the firm's average total cost is also $6 per unit. So it's receiving $6 per unit in revenue, but it's costing them $6 per unit to produce the 15 units of output, in which case it makes 0 economic profit per unit. So this statement is true. Do you believe Facebook is approaching monopoly status? Very briefly explain your response. So here you give a little written response. I'm going to be extremely merciful, and basically if you say anything that's vaguely sensible here, I'll give you a mark for that. So, I mean, if you say something totally ridiculous, then obviously then you wouldn't get a mark. If you said, I don't know, if you said something like, I'm friends with Michael Jackson on Facebook, then no mark for that. Alright, so just to give you a taste of how you would think about this, your answer to the question will depend on how theoretically pure you want to be. If you want to say that a market is monopolistic, if it has only one firm in it, and that firm produces a product which is unique, that is to say, there are no substitutes for it whatsoever, so the firm has no rivals at all, then you're really not going to be looking at any real-world examples, or at least not many real-world examples, in which you would say the market is a monopoly, except, say, in the case of national defence provided by the government or the justice system provided by the government. In that case, you could say, well, there are monopolies then. In every other case, you can always say, well, there's at least one substitute out there which is in some sense, however distant, a rival for the particular product offered by this particular firm. But normally when we're talking about the real world, we don't want to be that theoretically pure. We're really looking at a situation where a firm one firm is extremely dominant in the market. It has a very, very large market share. Right? So, for example, Wrigley's, the chewing gum company, has in Australia something like a 99% market share over chewing gum. Now, that doesn't mean, do we say it's a monopoly? Well, for all practical intents and purposes, we would say it's a monopoly, even though it's not the only seller in the marketplace, strictly speaking. Also, we need to think about how broadly you define the market. If we were to ask Mark Zuckerberg, he would define the market for Facebook in which Facebook exists and operates as, he would define that very broadly. And the reason you would do that is because if you define the market very broadly, you can say, well, there's lots of alternatives available in the marketplace. And so since there are lots of alternatives available, Facebook by definition wouldn't be a monopoly at all. Critics, on the other hand, tend to define the market in which Facebook operates more narrowly. So they'll define it as a market for social networking in which you have direct communications with your friends, and you can share your communications publicly and privately. You can upload pictures, and you can upload videos, and so on and so forth. You can comment on other people's videos and comment on other people's pictures, blah, blah, blah. And if you start defining the nature of the market in that way, then it narrows it considerably so that Facebook looks to be extremely dominant. The question, however, is not really asking whether it is a monopoly, but rather is asking whether Facebook is approaching monopoly status. And you could say in that case, well, it's striving to, at least. Every time a rival app of some kind emerges which in some way overlaps with Facebook functions, as a general rule, Facebook will either purchase that app itself and thereby eliminate that competition from the marketplace, or it will clone that app and then integrate it into its own platform, in the hope that this clone will become far more popular than the original app, thereby starving the original app of consumers and resulting in its ultimate demise. In that way, now that seems to be part of Facebook's overall strategy, so we can say that it's striving for monopoly status, it strives to eliminate competitors from the marketplace, and seems to be relatively successful in doing that. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But is it definitively approaching monopoly status? Well, see, that's starting to think about the future. So can we really seriously predict the future of Facebook? I think that's quite tricky. Economists and everyone else should really avoid making confident predictions about the future, because you very often end up with egg on your face. So, for example, there used to be a social network website called MySpace. Some of you may remember it, which was ultimately decimated by Facebook. But no one at the time of MySpace's height of popularity imagined that it was going to kick the bucket anytime soon, but it did. It's entirely possible that Facebook is the next MySpace that will be decimated by something coming along that no one has yet imagined. So who knows? Anyway, just to see the idea of how Zuckerberg and critics might try and wrangle over how broad or narrow the market is, here's a little taster from testimony that Zuckerberg gave to the US Senate. And here he's interacting with Senator Lindsey Graham.
Who's your biggest competitor?
Senator, we have a lot of competitors.
Who's your biggest?
I think the categories of... Do you want just one? I'm not sure I can give one, but can I give a bunch? Mm-hmm. So there are three categories that I would focus on. One are the other tech platforms, so Google, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft. We overlap with them in different ways.
Do they provide the same service you provide?
In different ways, different parts of it, yes.
This way, if I buy a Ford and it doesn't work well and I don't like it, I can buy a Chevy. If I'm upset with Facebook, what's the equivalent product that I can go sign up for?
Well, there's the second category that I was going to talk about.
I'm not talking about categories. I'm talking about, is there real competition you face? Because car companies face a lot of competition. If they make a defective car, it gets out in the world, people stop buying that car, they buy another one. Is it an alternative to Facebook in the private sector?
Yes, Senator. The average American uses 8 different apps to communicate with their friends and stay in touch with people, ranging from texting apps to email.
It's the same service you provide.
Well, we provide a number of different services.
Is Twitter the same as what you do?
It overlaps with a portion of what we do.
You don't think you have a monopoly?
It certainly doesn't feel like that to me.
Okay. So it doesn't. So Instagram, you bought Instagram. Why did you buy Instagram?
Because they were very talented app developers who were making good use of our platform and understood our values.
It was a good business decision. My point is that one way to regulate a company is through competition, through government regulation. Here's the question that all of us got to answer. What do we tell our constituents, given what's happened here, why we should let you self-regulate? What would you tell people in South Carolina that, given all the things we've just discovered here, it's a good idea for us to rely upon you to regulate your own business practices?
Well, Senator, my position is not that there should be no regulation. I think the internet is increasingly
You embrace regulation?
I think the real question, as the internet becomes more important in people's lives, is what is the right regulation, not whether there should be or not.
But you as a company welcome regulation?
I think if it's the right regulation, then yes.
You think the Europeans have it right?
I think that they get things right.
Have you ever submitted? That's true. So would you work with us in terms of what regulations you think are necessary in your industry?
Absolutely.
Okay. Would you submit to us some proposed regulations?
Yes, and I'll have my team follow up with you so that way we can have this discussion across the different categories where I think that this discussion needs to happen.
Look forward to it.
So you can see there the wrangling over how broadly or narrowly the market will be defined, and you can see how or why Zuckerberg would want to define the market very broadly and say, oh yes, we're just one of oodles of apps which are out there in the marketplace, because it avoids then being defined as a monopoly, which in the United States would then most likely trigger the Anti-Sherman Trust Act legislation, which would result in the breaking up of a monopoly, the selling off of its parts. Alright, so nothing particularly shocking or amazing in Zuckerberg's testimony there. The only thing that was a little bit, let's not say shocking or even really surprising, but certainly different to how the world operates in Europe and to a lesser extent Australia, is that the government in this case is openly and publicly saying to the company which it's conceivably going to regulate to provide its suggestions for regulations itself. So it's asking the fox what's the best way to secure their henhouse, which in other contexts, if this was done in a back room, would be regarded as bordering on the corruption of the democratic process. But in the United States, it happens in public. It's so common. Anyway, enough little political rants. Question 7. What type of externality is being generated in this market? And then we've got a set of options there. So we can see here that the marginal private costs are given by this curve, and we can see the marginal social costs are given by this curve, indicating that the cost to the society of each additional unit of output is greater than the costs to the suppliers, the private suppliers, the firms who produce this output. And that tells us that there are costs being borne by people external to the market that are not being taken account of by the private suppliers. The gap between the marginal social cost and the marginal private cost is the external costs borne by bystanders, by people external to the market. We can see that those external costs get larger and larger and larger as output gets bigger. Alright, so this is about the gap between the marginal social cost and the marginal private cost. So this is about production. So we're looking for externalities of production. So that's either the first one or the second one. And then we have to decide whether it's a positive or a negative externality. A negative externality here means a harm done to bystanders. So if there are costs being borne by bystanders, third parties, then that's a harm to them. So it's a negative externality of production. Question 8. Identify the free market equilibrium price and quantity. So the free market equilibrium price and quantity is going to be where the marginal private benefits just equal the marginal private costs. Right, because we're talking about private benefits and private costs, because we're talking about a free market which is unregulated by government. And obviously it's the private participants in the marketplace who are going to be interacting with each other. So where's the marginal private costs? Given here by this curve here. What about the marginal private benefits? Well, we've got a marginal social benefit curve, and since there's no marginal private benefit curve indicated, it must mean that the marginal private benefits are the same as the marginal social benefits. In other words, there are no externalities of consumption at work. Alright, so this is functioning not just as the marginal social benefit curve, but also the marginal private benefit curve. So we're looking for the point where the marginal private benefits equal the marginal private costs, and that occurs here. So the free market price would be $100 per tonne, and the free market quantity would be 80 tonnes per month. Identify the socially efficient price and quantity. The socially efficient price and quantity will be the point at which the marginal social benefits just equal the marginal social costs, and that occurs, as we can see, right here. So the socially efficient price would be $150 per tonne, and the socially efficient output would be 40 tonnes per month. Lucky last, if the government used a tax to ensure a socially optimal market outcome, how much tax in dollars would the government collect? So what the government will do is it will impose a tax on the suppliers to reflect the external cost that it's imposing on others. And by doing so, the private firm will internalize the external costs that it imposes on others. Effectively, what will happen is that the marginal private cost curve will be pushed up, if the tax is the right size, will be pushed up to the marginal social cost curve. And if that occurs, then the marginal social cost curve will become the supplier's cost curve, because there will be marginal private cost plus the taxes added. Alright, so if that occurred, we know that the socially optimal output and price is going to be 40 tonnes per month and $150. So we need to push the private cost curve upwards by a tax, like this, up to this point here. Now, that tax money is money that's going to go to the government. How much is that per tonne? Well, we can see that it's $100 per tonne that's going to go to the government. Then it's just a question of, well, how many tonnes? If it's $100 per tonne in tax revenue times 40 tonnes, that's $4,000 in tax revenue. And that's the answer to that question. Nighty night.